playing like the sound
Okay.
of microphones simply.
Fantastic. Okay, so we will make sure that our technician will fix it right now. And I think it is 8 now, so we're beginning our debate. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another English language debate run by the Warsaw Institute Review and Warsaw Institute. The topic that we're going to be discussing today with our honorable guest is geopolitics unmasked and Hong Kong, the people's revolution against the party. Obviously, there's so much more to the revolution than just disobedience to the Communist Party of China, but obviously this is quite an important part of the whole debate. Today, we're going to be talking for 1.5 hours, where our wonderful guests are going to tell us all about what's happening in Hong Kong, what caused the protest in Hong Kong, and what is the future of Hong Kong. Then we're going to move to the question and answers from you. So please, our dear audience, if you're in Poland, if you're in United States, please do write your questions down on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on YouTube. Our moderators will pick the nicest questions, and then we're going to pass them on to myself, and we're going to have a wonderful discussion with our guests. Before I move to the introduction of today's speakers, just a brief information that today's debate is organized by Warsaw Institute and the Warsaw Institute Review. Warsaw Institute Review is a quarterly journal, geopolitical one, all in English, that we are here publishing in Poland. The main focal points of Warsaw Institute Review is geopolitics with a big focus on the CEE and Poland. If you haven't seen our website, please do. Please come into our Facebook, leave a like, and see the work that we're doing. We're very passionate about it, so I'm sure you're going to love it. Second partner is Warsaw Institute. It's a sister organization, a think tank with a lot of long reports on the current geopolitical issues such as Brexit, human rights, and the gas wars between Russia and Europe. So yes, please keep us in mind, have a look at our websites, and we hope you're going to love them. And now moving on to the main part of the event, the two guests that we have with us today, Ms. Anna Fotyga, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, and Mr. Ben Rogers from London, a world-class expert, a human rights activist, and a journalist. Obviously, starting with our female guest, if I may briefly give you a bio of Minister Anna Fotyga. In the 80s, she has graduated the University of Gdańsk on international trade. Throughout the 80s until the fall of the Iron Curtain, Minister Fotyga has been actively involved in the opposition movement in Poland, the world-famous Solidarity that was fighting the communist oppression. After the Iron Curtain fell and the democracy set in Poland, Minister Fotyga has been an advisor to World Bank on many projects, and then her resume keeps on going with so many exciting things, including being the vice mayor of Gdańsk, one of the biggest cities in Poland, serving 2 terms in the Polish parliament, serving 3 terms in the European Parliament, being the chief of staff of the Polish presidential palace, and obviously, very importantly, being the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic in Poland. Amongst many fascinating things that Minister Fotyga did in the European Parliament, probably the most important one is being the chair of the subcommittee on security and defense. And the whole Poland is very proud of it, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has chosen Minister Fotyga among other 9 world-renowned experts to work on the upcoming reform of NATO, which is coming soon. It's actually just being prepared right now, so it's very exciting. We're all waiting for it. And now, quickly moving to our second speaker, Mr. Ben Rogers from London. He has graduated both the Royal Holloway University in London and the School of African and Oriental Studies. He is predominantly, I would say, a human rights activist who is a journalist as well. His articles were featured in the top class of world media, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Huffington Post, but also BBC quite frequently too. On top of being an activist and a journalist, Mr. Rogers is also an avid advisor to a number of governments and international bodies, including but definitely not limited to the United Nations, the UK government, UK Parliament, the US Senate, and many more. So Ms. Fotyga, Mr. Rogers, thank you very much for being with us. And let's go on and move to the main topic of our discussion, which is Hong Kong. I am sure that majority of the viewers with us today, they know everything about Hong Kong, but if I may very briefly give you a introduction of what the Hong Kong issue is, and then we're going to be jumping into the questions. So as you probably all know, Hong Kong used to be a British colony for over 150 years. The part of Hong Kong was ceded to the United Kingdom following the War of 1842. And then, interestingly enough, about 50 years later, China leased the rest of Hong Kong to the United Kingdom for 99 years. The Hong Kong quite quickly became an important part of the economic map of the world. In the 60s and the 50s, it quickly became a spot for trading and manufacture of various goods. In the 1980s, when the eyes of most of the world were probably gazing upon Eastern Europe and the crumbling Soviet Union, important things were happening in Hong Kong, and we tend to forget about it. What started to happen is that China started talks with the United Kingdom about the future of Hong Kong when the 99 lease finishes. What came out of those debates is the 1984 agreement signed between Margaret Thatcher and the People's Republic of China. The document is often referred to as one country, two systems, and the basic premises of the deal was that it will be in 1997 the United Kingdom will give Hong Kong back to China, but China will not have full authority over it, meaning that Hong Kong will be allowed to keep its economic system, it will be allowed to keep its political system, which was obviously made to promote democracy, hoping that the people of Hong Kong will choose democracy over the communist regime in China. The lease, or the one country, two system deal went in power in 1997, and then it was to be in power for 50 years, so until 2047, the system of one country, two states, or two systems was in power. Unfortunately, this was just a theory. What's actually happening is starting in the year 2000, the tensions between China and the inhabitants of Hong Kong started brewing up. We had small issues, small protests popping up because of various cases of discrimination and of Chinese involvement in Hong Kong, which was just a little bit too much for its inhabitants. And then what started happening is obviously the 2019 boom, let's call it, of the social protests of Hong Kong people against China. This was all caused by a murder case out there in Hong Kong that sparked the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government to come up with an extradition bill. The official reason for the extradition bill that would allow the citizens of Hong Kong to be extradited to China to face trial officially was to obviously punish the murderer, punish the people who commit severe crimes. But in reality, what the people of Hong Kong feared is that when in power, the extradition bill may soon actually be used against them. It may be used against the opposition parties, against social leaders, to actually extradite them to China to silence them. And so what happened, we all know, starting in the beginning of 2019, the various protests, at first peaceful, then turning into violent riots as police became more and more brutal, started growing, and now, following the following the slow cooling down of the COVID pandemic, the again. And obviously China is also renewing its actions against Hong Kong, or aim to actually weaken Hong Kong in the form of the national security bill. So moving on to our wonderful guests and finishing my introduction, the first question would be to Minister Anna Fotyga. Dear Honorable Minister, could you please tell us a little bit more about the background of the protests and the background to what sparked the protest and how the protest began in China? Oh, and in Hong Kong, obviously.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm really happy and privileged to be a part of this panel. Of the Warsaw Institute, and moreover to be together with Mr. Rogers, who is really well-known expert and advisor. I know him naturally, and I really value his expertise. So I wouldn't like to pretend I'm more knowledgeable than himself about details, and I look forward to listening to his statements on this. Let me give also perspective of politician and the politician of Central and Eastern Europe. That is true, with quite special background. Actually, you were talking about my fascinating assignments, but actually until now I consider the most beautiful and challenging work in Foreign Department of Solidarność. It was my work, my love, my friendship, everything. So and until now, it was the most fascinating work, including all other things. Now, my engagement in the European Parliament is to serve as coordinator on foreign affairs in Foreign Affairs Committee, meaning that I have to negotiate positions of whole political group on every detail, actually, of foreign policy, and that means quite a comprehensive work, and also on China. I saw that not only in our region, actually in whole Europe, it was not so easy to come up with concise and unified view. It's not my focusing on China is not because it is so high in the agenda, and moreover it is so high in agenda of our most important allies. Actually, I started to monitor human rights there quite early. And also, it was very easy to see the obvious link between China becoming more and more authoritarian and intimidating people in mainland China, and actions taken vis-a-vis territories like Hong Kong and Taiwan, for example. Of course, Taiwan is still a vibrant democracy with excellent president just elected for the second time. But of course, people are Taiwan monitor situation in Hong Kong closely, and they are afraid, naturally. During my previous terms in the European Parliament, we were focused from time to time, naturally, on situation in Hong Kong. Usually when things started to arise, and when I look into time, I think that our permanent monitoring or focusing started in 2012 or around to 2012, maybe slightly earlier. Of course, we were aware of all actions taken in mainland vis-à-vis Uyghurs, vis-à-vis members of elite trying to criticize the ruling Communist Party. But what started to emerge in Hong Kong, it was quite visible that policy seems to become quite concise and aimed not only at crushing protesting people or intimidating criticism. China simply wanted to curb the autonomy of Hong Kong, trying to impose step by step creeping grip on authority, and now actually with the government of Hong Kong we have people who simply turn in every case to obey the Beijing indications, trying to crush their own citizens, predominantly young people. We decided to submit resolutions in previous term of the European Parliament, monitoring actions taken vis-à-vis book publishers of the renowned publishing house, the Mighty Current. They were abducted and taken to mainland China. There were protests, resolutions, and then after some time, eruptions of protests after imposing of the extradition law, as you rightly mentioned already. Now we have the next stage of this grip, so national security law adopted by Chinese Parliament on 22nd of May, and now coming to or enacted by authorities. We were almost sure, all of us who are engaged in observing actions by Beijing, we were almost sure that Beijing was willing to use the pretext of COVID-19 to move forward, because it is the usual way of from my point of view, of communist rule, every communist rule to use this kind of opportunity to tighten the grip and to pursue policy that was earlier decided. And therefore this move, I'm almost sure. We have to remember that it is not only very controversial policy vis-à-vis Hong Kong and Taiwan, because many actions were taken against Taiwan as well, much more of let's say kinetic nature or military nature, being in cybersecurity. Here cybersecurity and in civilian areas is also visible in Hong Kong naturally, but much more of military action was needed vis-a-vis Taiwan. We have to remember also the military build-up of China in South China Sea and East China Sea that was directed against free world. It was undermining freedom of navigation. That is, I would say, one of the most important principles of free world, and European Union, international community is very much engaged in monitoring this situation, trying to prevent those actions, and therefore we are worried about, also myself, traveling quite a lot to Far East, including Taiwan. We were prevented from traveling to Hong Kong recently because of COVID-19. We wanted to send ad hoc delegation of the European Parliament in February this year. We were prevented from doing this, but surely European Parliament is not to abandon Hong Kong people, opposition of Hong Kong. We try to duplicate the action taken by UK parliamentarians, and we organize what we call now Hong Kong Watch as well. Similarly, the leader of this is Miriam Lexman of Slovakia, and Reinhard Bütikofer, Miriam of EPP, the biggest political group within the European Parliament. Reinhard Bütikofer is of Greens, and myself representing the conservative political group within European Parliament. We are engaged in this due to unanimous request of political groups, probably except of the far right and far left of the parliament. We have debate with resolution during June next session of the European Parliament, but that is about us being outspoken, and I value it very much indeed. But actually, I'm first and foremost a politician, a person of action. And therefore, I think that we have to decide on practical things. We have to assess, and COVID-19 helps us to do this. Chains of supply. Actually, I started my work this legislature, the current ninth legislature of the European Parliament, with questions to the Commission about supply chains of pharmaceuticals or components to important life-saving pharmaceuticals, medicines for the EU. Actually, during COVID-19, we were able to observe actually limits to our independence, our dependence of Chinese supplies. There are many other things, myself being focused on security and defense predominantly. I'm very worried about actions taken by PRC vis-à-vis 5G and the state of play in the European Union. I think that with the organization that tries to keep firm hand on competences and internal market. Our guidelines vis-à-vis 5G are pretty loose. And we were not able to present unified principles vis-à-vis this. I hope that we have to make the overview of the situation. I learned that actions taken by Lord Patten, former last British governor of Hong Kong, and many other British politicians and public figures were quite successful, and actually I think that the legislative actions taken vis-à-vis 5G were much more tight, successful, that the earlier attempt to leave 35% of possibilities for Chinese investment in 5G in less dangerous areas it was already revised, and hopefully the same thing happens in other European countries. I'm sorry, I cannot tell that UK is within the EU.
Unfortunately, we would very much like to see the UK back in the EU, but oh well.
We were together with British Conservatives in one political group, so we miss them really. I for quite a long time I observed their work in variety of areas, spheres of EU, and I think it was great contribution, terrific contribution. I miss it, really.
So Minister,
I would like to take too much time. Sorry, it was just political overview, but we have to use variety of tools, not only declarations, resolutions, and memoranda. I think that we have tools on our disposal to exert pressure on PRC to observe obligations coming out of PRC's position in UN Security Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And so, Mr. Rogers, you probably heard what Minister Fotyga just spoke about, and what she spoke about a lot is the aggressive policies of the People's Republic of China. And we saw it not only with regards to Hong Kong, but also Taiwan, also the South Chinese Sea, where they have been building artificial bases. So in the recent years, we saw quite an outsurge of aggressive actions of China towards, I can't even risk saying, global security and global peace. Obviously, the main thing that I have forgot to mention when introducing you is that you are a co-founder of Hong Kong Watch, an organization, an NGO organization that oversees human rights abuses in Hong Kong. And the fascinating story is obviously how the Hong Kong Watch actually came to exist. And obviously, I don't want to tell the story for you, but the Hong Kong Watch started to exist following that 2017 denial of entrance, where the Chinese government did not allow you to enter Hong Kong, despite the fact that you have been living there for 5 years. And the then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson intervened himself. Unfortunately, with the intervention not being fruitful, because the Chinese government just simply denied you entrance, and that's probably the spark that actually lit the fire of the Hong Kong watch. And now my question would be, what perspective of someone interested in Hong Kong caused China to actually get involved and to actually threaten Hong Kong so much starting 2019? So 2019, we see the extradition bill. Now we see the introduction of the national security bill. From your perspective, why now? I know that 2047 is still far away, and China probably doesn't really want to wait so much time for Hong Kong. But what would be your perspective, the Hong Kong perspective, on when China woke up and said, "I want Hong Kong now"?
Well, thank you very much. Can I first of all say what a privilege it is to take part in this this important event, and a particular privilege to share this panel with Minister Fotyga, and I pay tribute to her commitment to Hong Kong. First of all, we've worked together on a number of initiatives already, and I really appreciate all of her support, but also the wider commitment to the values of democracy and human rights, not just in theory, but actually lived out through your own lives in the struggle under communism and then the transition to democracy in your own country. And I have never had the opportunity yet to visit Poland, but I have always been a great admirer of Poland and of other countries that have first-hand experience of living under communism. And you know better than anyone what the people in China, the people in Hong Kong are going through, and what the people of Taiwan fear if their freedom is taken away from them. And very often I think that whereas it should be countries like my own, who both have a moral and legal responsibility to Hong Kong, but also have been if you like, the cradle of parliamentary democracy for so long, it should be our countries that should be much quicker than sadly we sometimes are to defend these values. But in reality, it's countries like Poland and others that understand these things firsthand, and you're very often in the vanguard of this struggle. And I'm glad to say my own government has now taken the lead it should have done a long time ago, and is responding to the current crisis in the way it should. Just as of the last few days, some unprecedented announcements that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab have made. But I'm grateful to your own country and others that understand this firsthand. And I should say that although I was a teenager when Poland's own solidarity struggle was taking place, and so I wasn't actively involved. I was involved in observing it, but not actively involved in supporting it. But it certainly provided an inspiration for all of the human rights work that I've gone on to do in other parts of the world. Let me also just, you kindly mentioned the Hong Kong Watch. Just some very brief background before I come to your question. I first went to China when I was 18 years old and taught English in mainland China. And then I went to Hong Kong and lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover of Hong Kong. And I honestly felt during the 5 years that I lived in Hong Kong from 1997 to 2002, that at that time, the experiment of one country, two systems, of having a free city that, okay, was not fully democratic, but nevertheless had the rule of law and basic freedoms and was one of the most open cities in Asia, having that still under Chinese sovereignty, but not under the Chinese Communist Party's system, was a remarkable experiment, and that basically did work for the first maybe 10 years after the handover, and certainly the 5 years that I lived there. Not perfect, did see small, subtle erosion of it even during the time I lived there, but nevertheless, when I left in 2002, I left reasonably hopeful that Hong Kong had a good future, and I was focused on other parts of Asia where the human rights situation was much, much worse. The turning point for me in terms of what re-engaged my attention in Hong Kong's situation came going back to 2014 when the umbrella movement happened. And I realized when I saw the mass protests in 2014 that something fundamental had changed in Hong Kong. And so I started to re-engage initially in a personal capacity in my spare time, and then eventually ended up hosting a number of Hong Kong activists visiting the UK, and finally felt there was a need to have an organization to speak out for Hong Kong, and that's how Hong Kong Watch came to be. But just before the launch of Hong Kong Watch, as you rightly say, I tried to visit the city that had once been my home, where I'd begun my working life, and which I had gone back to a number of times between 2002 and 2017. But I found in October 2017 that under the orders of Beijing, I was told I was no longer welcome in Hong Kong and was put back on a plane. And as you say, it became quite a major incident. It got a lot of media attention, a lot of political attention. It was raised in both houses of the British Parliament a number of times. And I always said to people, I'm happy, I would like people to raise this case at that time, but not because of me. I always said to people, don't make it about me. Make it about what this decision to deny a foreigner. My only intention of going to Hong Kong was to meet people. I wasn't going to do anything, radical. I wasn't even planning to do any speaking engagements or any media engagements. I was just going to meet people privately. And what does it say about the erosion, even back then, of Hong Kong's freedoms and autonomy if the Chinese Communist Party regime is so afraid of one individual meeting people privately that they're prepared to deny me entry? And so my case did serve to put a spotlight on the situation in Hong Kong, and I was glad that it helped draw attention to that. Of course, since my case, firstly, there have been a number of other foreigners who've had a similar experience, including the executive director of Human Rights Watch and the Asia editor of the Financial Times, who was based in Hong Kong and was expelled from the city. But far more seriously than our own cases, of course, has been the terrible violations of human rights, the imprisonment of peaceful protesters, the disqualification of democratic lawmakers and candidates, the abduction of booksellers, as has been mentioned, the police brutality in the case of the protests. So your question of why now, and I think there are perhaps several stages to the answer to that question. I think one of the turning points was that in Hong Kong's basic law, the mini constitution of Hong Kong, there are, among the many promises in the basic law, there are two commitments in the basic law that are relevant to this discussion today. The first is that there is a commitment to introduce universal suffrage at some point for elections for chief executive of Hong Kong. And the second is that there is in Article 23 of the Basic Law a commitment to introduce a national security law, but it says very clearly that that should be implemented by the Hong Kong legislature on its own. In other words, it shouldn't be imposed by Beijing. And in my view, the first should always precede the second. So every country has a right, of course, to defend national security, provided that is properly defined, provided it's balanced with protection for fundamental freedoms and rights, and provided that it's in the context of a democratic, accountable system where those rights are protected. So I would argue that universal suffrage, which is promised in the Basic Law, should have been introduced first, and then a security law that is compliant with international standards on human rights and basic freedoms, would be acceptable. In 2014, pressure was growing for universal suffrage. And Beijing eventually said, okay, we will consider introducing universal suffrage, one person, one vote for chief executive, but we will choose the candidates for chief executive. The people very understandably said, well, that's not what is meant. And Martin Lee, the father figure of the democracy movement, said at the time, if Beijing is choosing all three candidates, what is the difference, he put it, what is the difference between a rotten apple, a rotten orange, and a rotten banana? And which I thought was a very vivid way of capturing the problem with that proposal. Anyway, that proposal led to what became known as the Umbrella Movement in 2014, mass protests against that. That eventually dissipated, from between 2014 and 2019, there were occasional protests, and of course continued movement. But in 2019, as you said in the introduction, there was the proposed extradition law, which essentially would have torn apart the firewall that was really created at the heart of the one country, two systems model to separate the two legal systems. The legal system in Hong Kong, which is based on the rule of law, on independence of the judiciary, on fair trial, and all the other fundamental elements of the rule of law, versus the system in mainland China, which is absolutely not rule of law, it's rule by law, where there's no such thing as an independent judiciary, there's no such a fair trial, there's arbitrary detention, torture, executions, disappearances, and so on. And not surprisingly, pretty much every sector in Hong Kong spoke up against it, starting with the legal sector. Unusually, the business sector came out against it, and it's quite unusual to see the business sector in unity with the pro-democracy camp, but they were on this issue. And of course, the international community and many foreign ministers and world leaders around the world were speaking out against it. And at every turn, Carrie Lam, the chief executive, could and should have listened to those opinions and should have stepped back. And she didn't. And so the protests grew. And the protests were overwhelmingly peaceful, certainly for the first few months. Amazing scenes of at 1.1 million on the streets, and then the next week 2 million on the streets, totally peaceful. The police responded to these peaceful protests with, in my opinion, totally indiscriminate, disproportionate and unacceptable violence, even in those early stages, using tear gas and pepper spray and rubber bullets and batons. I remember seeing one of the songs that became a sort of anthem of the protest movement early on was a religious song, a Christian song, "Sing Hallelujah to the Lord." And but Hong Kong people have a wonderful sense of humor as well, because not everybody singing this song was necessarily of a religious background, but it just caught on throughout the movement. But there was I remember seeing a placard early on of a protester holding this banner saying to the police, "Don't shoot or beat our kids, or we will sing hallelujah to the Lord," because this song was a bit repetitive, and so it was an amusing example of the sense of humor of the protesters. But then tensions built up. A small, more radical element of the protesters did resort to acts of violence, and I want to be very clear that I don't condone those acts of violence at all. I think ideally there should never be a place for violence. I think peaceful protest has the moral authority and the moral power to be much more persuasive. But I can understand, without condoning, I can understand that those who resorted to violence, first of all, were responding to police violence. So they were responding to brutality and aggression from the police. And secondly, they were acting out of desperation and frustration at a government that it was refusing to listen. And that's how the situation escalated. But why is China acting now to introduce this national security law? I think several reasons. first of all, I think they were alarmed, of course, by the movement over the last year. They're alarmed by anything that they think may have the potential to inspire dissent in the rest of China. I think they were particularly frightened by the overwhelming result in the district council elections in December, where the overwhelming majority of people voted for pro-democracy parties. And it was highly likely that that same result would be repeated or something similar in the legislative council elections coming up in September. And I think Beijing felt they had to do everything possible to prevent that outcome in September, because the last thing they want is a legislature either with a pro-democracy majority or a significant minority that could prevent controversial legislation going through. So I think they acted for that reason. Clearly, they acted taking the opportunity of the COVID-19 pandemic when they calculated that the international community was understandably otherwise focused on the pandemic. I'm glad that the international community has, to some extent, proven them wrong by reacting very strongly, at least vocally and with some measures as well. But I think taking advantage of this timing was in their mind. But all of this, I think, can be traced back, as I've said, to 2014, where they proposed this sham universal suffrage of choosing the candidates. The people made it clear they rejected that. The people spoke again through their protests last year. The people spoke again at the ballot box in December, and the people were expected to speak again at the ballot box in September this year. And after everything that's happened over the last year, I think Beijing felt they had to do something drastic, and it's tragic that it has come to this. And I hope that international opinion and international action can have some effect. But that is where we are today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. So before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to remind all of our viewers that you're more than welcome to ask questions. Just please write them down below in the comments section. We're going to have a look at them, and we're going to be giving them to our experts shortly. But Mrs. Fotyga, a question. Mr. Rogers, when finalizing his speech, said that we have to gather the international opinion, we have to gather the international organizations to stand up to China, to start doing something. So my question to you would be, what can international organizations, what can international community, the European Parliament, NATO, our governments do to actually stop China from acting violently against Hong Kong, or at least to delay these aggressive actions, giving a little bit of more breathing space to them?
First and foremost, although China is a member of UN Security Council, we have to remember that Sino-British Declaration was properly notified within the UN, and therefore there are some instruments to be used that are at UN disposal, even against Security Council or vis-a-vis Security Council member, and most probably we can appeal. I think that here unified view of the free democratic world. So EU request also countries like US, Canada, Japan, Australia, others. It is possible to request the UN envoy or a special or a rapporteur on human rights in Hong Kong. The situation starts to be extremely hot. Mr. Rogers excellently portrayed the situation there. I know that in the hottest stage of COVID, Hong Kong government started to arrest, to detain people for their pre-COVID-19 actions, just thinking it would be or remain unnoted by international community. So there is one thing we have to be outspoken within EU naturally. All governments should take this into account. In the EU, we have the way of publishing annually the report on human rights all over the world, and therefore Hong Kong is already for quite a long time high in the agenda. We have to monitor closely the activities of EU institution in this respect. But as I say, many tools are there in sanctions regimes. I think that it is highest time to think about sanctioning those who are responsible for intimidation and crimes against people. We have to use also tools that are at our disposal, and they are in more, let's say, economic sphere. I know that in my region, in Central and Eastern Europe, and here I have to return to some parts of our history, even under communist rule and within communist bloc, I think that to some extent China was perceived as in maybe naive or ideal terms as counterbalancing the influence of Russia on our territories. The Soviet Union at that time, and now part of this spirit is still there in our region, thinking that it may be countering the direct or existential threat that to many of us is perceived from the side of Russia with military buildup of Russia. I speak to you from Gdansk. It is just few hundred kilometers from Kaliningrad, and the threat is obvious for people living here, and especially with policies that were very friendly within free world in the West vis-a-vis Russia, also naive. People of Central and Eastern Europe used to think about China as kind of counterbalancing the power of Russia. Now we have to look into reality, in details of this, see the influence on many areas. When we think about economy, we have to remember then that even with opening to China in the region, Chinese exports, for example, to Poland is 10 times as much as Polish export to China. So we have to be realistic and knowing that we have to deal with a state, country that is extremely effective in economic expansion and not acting to the benefit of partners. Simply, there are two different areas, and our dependence on many many supplies is too high. Therefore, we have to use argumentation vis-a-vis those who might think, okay, China is distant. We cannot see immediate danger from this country. But first and foremost, there is much cohesion in cyber campaigns, in cyber security action between China and Russian Federation. I would add from my side, I would add Iran to this, because we also see some kind of coordinated actions there with Iran. We have huge campaigning of PRC vis-a-vis whole Europe, including our countries, using COVID-19. And I would say that we have to look into reality, to look into details and start to see our real position in relationship to China. And moreover, our tradition in although human rights are not so high in the agenda nowadays in Poland, maybe I would like to be slightly bold, because same people who used to engage in relationship with China and turn blind eyes on, and I mean also Western Europe, other countries, turn blind eyes on mass violation of human rights, used argumentation against countries like Poland. When how can you compare? I turn to our audience. How can you compare situation of human rights in freedom judiciary of countries we are speaking about with what has happened in our part of Europe, including Poland, and the level of I would say lies is really big, and we have to avoid hypocrisy in assessment of things. So to cut the long story short, I think we have plenty of tools at our disposal. We have to start being united on this. I agree, geopolitics, and I'm a person dealing with security, so geopolitics is important for me. But we are a country with enormous tradition in supporting human rights and being outspoken in these terms. I would like to recall Polish proverbs on and sayings on many things, but yes, we have a lesson to also repeat here.
Thank you very much. And so directly relating to this question, Mr. Rogers, the last question was about what the international community can actually do to help improve the situation in Hong Kong. But probably an equally important question would be what non-governmental organizations like the Hong Kong Watch can actually do to improve the situation. And obviously seeing a lot of similar organizations emerge after the protest, which is obviously fantastic. What can these organizations, but also what can we, as our viewers, as me, myself, who care about Hong Kong, what can we do to actually improve the situation in Hong Kong. And I will be requesting if you can keep your response fairly brief, to about 5 to 7 minutes, just because I am getting
sorry for my not
no problem. But I'm getting aware that our viewers have plenty of questions, so I wanted to leave plenty of time for our experts to answer them. But I'm leaving the floor to you, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you very much. I will be very brief, and I'll answer that question first. But if I may, in the 5 minutes or so that I have, just add also a comment on the Chinese regime's growing international threat, because I think this isn't just about the freedoms of Hong Kong and China, important though those are. It is also about our own freedoms as well. But in answer to your direct question, I think the role of civil society, human rights organizations, and the general public is clearly to help those like Minister Fortiga in parliaments to be better informed. I mean, the minister is extremely well informed, but other parliamentarians who need to be better informed and equipped with the information and the recommendations that they can then take forward from their political platforms to make a difference for Hong Kong. I know, and we were talking just before we went live, that I'm privileged to be able to focus on these issues full-time. Well, I'm actually not full-time on Hong Kong, but I'm full-time on human rights, and I have the capacity to do the in-depth research and information gathering, whereas parliamentarians inevitably and understandably have a whole range of responsibilities and issues that they're dealing with. And so part of our role is to brief and inform parliamentarians and policymakers so that they understand the situation firsthand, sometimes provide platforms and avenues for people from Hong Kong to be able to access and speak to parliamentarians and policymakers themselves, and to encourage governments. I use the word encourage rather than lobby, but to actions. So we have a whole range of recommendations that we're calling for, many of which have already been touched upon. Things like applying targeted Magnitsky-style sanctions on officials in the Chinese and Hong Kong governments responsible for human rights violations. We've had a huge effort in the United Kingdom to over the last couple of years to encourage the British government to do more for those Hong Kongers who hold British national overseas passports, and that's resulted in the historic announcement by Boris Johnson in the last day or so. But I don't think Boris Johnson's announcement would have happened if it hadn't been for the work of groups like us. I'm not trying to claim credit, but I just think groups like us lay the foundations to make those things possible. But in turn, we couldn't actually do what we do if it wasn't for the wider general public joining with us to persuade their individual elected representatives to take up these issues. We can do a certain amount through interaction with parliamentarians. But I think, as Minister Fortiga would probably agree, when a parliamentarian hears from their own constituent about an issue, I mean, there are parliamentarians like Minister Fortiga who would take up these issues because they genuinely care and because they hear from us. But there are others who might not if they just heard from an NGO. But if they hear from a constituent, then that really helps. So our different systems, vary in style, but I think the heart of parliamentary democracy is the role of the citizen in lobbying their member of parliament. So together, citizens and NGOs can do that. We can provide the detailed information. Citizens can provide the pressure or the appeal to their elected representatives. Just very briefly, I wanted to just say something on the issue of the Chinese regime's very aggressive approach well beyond its borders. And what I'm about to say is in many ways minuscule compared to the big questions that we're looking at in terms of its severity. But nevertheless, I think it's something worth mentioning. And that is that over the last 2.5 years, I myself have directly encountered the Chinese regime's aggression beyond its borders in the form of, first of all, a number, probably, I've lost count now, but there have been so many, but probably 20 or 30 anonymous letters, threatening letters coming to my home address in London, which is not normally publicly available, but also to all the neighbours in my street where I live. And the first letter that came had my picture on it, taken from the internet, and the words "watch him." And it said to all my neighbours, "This person lives in your street. He's causing trouble in Asia. Please keep an eye on him and find out what he's doing." Nothing happened to me. My neighbours are all fine, and they thought it was ridiculous. But the idea that the Chinese Communist Party would think that a tactic that is normal, sadly, in China for dissidents would work on the streets of London was ridiculous. But then there was more. My mother, who lives in a different part of the country, started to receive anonymous letters saying, "Please tell your son to stop doing what he's doing." And thankfully she just laughed and said, "I gave up trying to tell my son what to do a long time ago." And then my employers received letters. Then I started to receive anonymous emails. Now a number of other friends and colleagues working on Hong Kong have had similar experiences, have had letters and emails to themselves or to family members. And then I've also had, on at least 4 different occasions, 4 different British members of Parliament telling me that they themselves had been lobbied by the Chinese embassy in London, telling them to tell me to stop doing what I'm doing. And to their credit, all 4 members of Parliament made it clear that they were not telling me to stop. They were just reporting to me what they'd been approached with. But in many ways, it's ridiculous. And you would have thought that a country that is supposed to be a superpower would not be wasting its time talking to MPs about one individual activist in London. But on the other hand, it is a taste, and there are many other examples I could give, but it's just a snapshot of their aggression. And I think one of the things that has led to this, and Minister Fortier touched on this as well, is that for too long, I think, Western democracies have, to use the Chinese expression, have kowtowed to the Chinese regime for too long. And therefore, the Chinese regime has been emboldened into thinking that they can get away with either with this kind of aggression in our own country, which is basically a threat to our freedoms, or far worse, it's repression within its own country and in Hong Kong. And I think if we had been bolder earlier on in standing up to the regime, we may not be where we are today. But it's not too late to change, and I think I wrote an article recently where I said we need to end Operation Kowtow and begin Operation Stand Up Tall. And I think actually the Chinese regime, they may not like it when we stand up to them, but I think they actually, if we stand up and defend our values, our heritage, our beliefs for ourselves and for those who are suffering in China and Hong Kong. And actually, we may have a chance over the long term of having a more equal relationship and therefore a more beneficial relationship than we do when we are in the position of kowtowing and the Chinese Communist Party is, as a result, emboldened.
Thank you. And thank you so much for sharing the insight, both from the government perspective, but also from the NGO and your own personal experiences. And thank you very much for the conversation that we had. And I think now we have 20 minutes, which should be absolutely fine for the questions from the audience. I do see that we have about 6 or 7 of them. So this time, again, sorry, but I will have to ask you to keep your responses quite brief, couple of sentences, so then we can get more people asking questions. And I can see that the first questions we have here is to Mr. Rogers, and it concerns the UK's position on Hong Kong. So today, we've seen quite, or was yesterday actually, we saw quite a major shift in how the UK government approaches Hong Kong. Because we had this groundbreaking promise of actually being able to grant nationality to the people of Hong Kong. But how do you think the UK's political influence on Hong Kong and the policies that the government is going to be pursuing are going to be changing or shifting? Are we going to see more and more involvement towards forcing Hong Kong to remain independent and to push China away? Or do you think this is a big event, but now we're going to be on the downside and we're going to slowly forget about Hong Kong for a while now?
No, I think this is the start of a new approach to policy, both on Hong Kong and on China as a whole. I think what we've seen in the last few months, even before the Hong Kong crisis that we're facing right now, is that because of COVID-19, I think there has been a major rethinking on the part of the UK. Part of that is coming from parliamentarians, but the pressure from parliamentarians on the government, and particularly from parliamentarians from the majority party in the party in government, the Conservative Party, I think is very significant indeed now. And so there are both members of parliament pressing the government and ministers privately within the government who are pushing for a further shift. And so I'm reasonably confident that we will see that, and certainly NGOs like my own will keep up the encouragement to the government to keep moving. I want to give the government credit though, because I think even though one can say that it came rather late, nevertheless it came, and it came in a really historic and somewhat unexpected way. I'm not sure any of us dared to believe that the government would go as far as they have done, and so I welcome it. But I hope what the government will now do is, on Hong Kong, is to mobilize the international community much more and coordinate with the international community. One of the problems I've found in advocacy has been that other countries have said to me, we're willing to help, but Britain, as the signatory to the Sino-British Joint Declaration, should be leading. Whereas the British government has said to me, we can't do this on our own. We want other countries to work with us. Well, now there's a chance to work together if Britain, now that Britain has taken a position. So I hope there will be leadership on, for example, it was mentioned earlier, calling for a United Nations, either envoy or rapporteur on human rights, or both. You could have an envoy focused on the reconciliation and dialogue side, and a rapporteur focusing on monitoring the human rights situation, coordinating implementation of sanctions by not just piecemeal, but by different countries together, coordinating a package among like-minded countries to help those vulnerable activists in Hong Kong who aren't BNO holders, but who may be in grave danger under this law. Can we work together to share responsibility for giving them sanctuary? Those are just a few of the things we could do. More broadly, we've already talked about supply chains, and I hope Britain will move in the direction of completely reevaluating our supply chains and abandoning the deal with Huawei, for example, in the 5G sector, and many other things we can do. I'll stop there because of time, but I hope, I'm cautiously optimistic that we're seeing not just a one-off announcement by the Prime Minister, but a shift. And if that shift isn't quite there, be assured that many parliamentarians and NGOs like ourselves will keep pressing to see that shift.
Let's hope that what you say will come true, and the pressure will be maintained on the UK government, but also on the European governments. Minister Fotyga, I do have two questions to yourself, quite interesting ones as well. The first question would be, how do you think, how much longer can the one country, two systems system be upheld in Hong Kong? So do you think that the special status of Hong Kong can be maintained until 2047? Maybe it can actually be extended, or do you think it's actually about to collapse? And then the second question related to this is about the Legislative Council elections in 2020. Do you think that the outcome of the elections does have a potential to actually uphold the independence of Hong Kong, or the conclusion is going to be very sad and Hong Kong is doomed to fall into the hand of the Communist Party of China?
Well, I think that thanks to existence of Taiwan, the principle of one country, two systems still exists in this world. Unfortunately, I think it does not apply to Hong Kong. Not yet that all actions taken and actually the modalities of Hong Kong being the government system, the behavior of uniformed services, the pressure on business, the pressure in particular on young people means that and first and foremost undermining of judiciary system by adoption of extradition law and then the last imposing on national security law means dismantling of this principle vis-a-vis Hong Kong. So yet I'm very cautiously optimistic. I think that momentum is there within international community, that we aim at unified action. Countries that were very reluctant, I think, have to slowly change policies. Partly it was accelerated by COVID-19. Maybe we have better news before 2022, actually. So, although I'm very reluctant to speak optimistically about next months of Hong Kong, I think that in longer perspective we may be successful. Actually, I've seen changes in this world that were not are difficult to imagine for all of us, including changes in Poland. So I am generally optimistic I see real move in this direction and hopefully we are able to succeed.
And let's all hope for the best of the outcomes. One other question that I'm getting, and I think it's a very fascinating question, and it will be a question to both of our experts, but maybe starting with Mr. Rogers. And the question is not so much about Hong Kong, but about Taiwan. So there has been rumors, and these rumors have been circulating for quite a while, that it's the people of Taiwan that are secretly supporting the independence movements in Hong Kong in terms of providing support, providing refuge. So the question is, should the rumors be confirmed and people of Taiwan would be helping or were already helping Hong Kong, do you think that this has a potential to degrade the situation in Taiwan even further? Do you think that even the rumors about Taiwan supporting Hong Kong has a potential to deteriorate relations between China and Taiwan and maybe even force China to introduce more aggressive legislation towards it?
Yes, I certainly it has that potential, because this is a regime in Beijing that totally does not tolerate any form of opposition, and you can see even the aggressive rhetoric that just in the last 24 hours, the reaction to the British government's actions, and the British government's actions in the big scheme of things, whilst they're historic and very welcome, they have come somewhat late. They are in keeping with Britain's responsibilities under an international treaty, and they were expressed in a very typically British sort of moderate diplomatic way, even though it's clearly a shift of policy. And yet Beijing has reacted with its typically furious rhetoric. So you can imagine how much more furious Beijing is already with Taiwan. I think Taiwan is to be applauded for the courageous steps that it's taken to support the principles that we're talking about for Hong Kong, regardless of what practical help there is. And I think that it is incumbent on all of us who believe in democracy and human rights to stand with Taiwan much more than we have done already. I'm not necessarily suggesting full recognition, although I wouldn't be opposed to that if there was the will to do that. But that's not what I'm proposing. But certainly a stronger relationship, because this is a country that has, firstly, that is a vibrant democracy that's just had a very successful democratic election and re-elected the president. She's a president who has repeatedly spoken up for human rights, not just for Hong Kong, but more generally. I attended twice last year 2 different conferences on human rights that were both opened by the president. One has appointed a special envoy, special ambassador for religious freedom, as far as I know, the only Asian country to do so. But also, it has been exemplary in its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, both within its own territory and in terms of its generosity to the rest of the world, in stark contrast to the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party, both domestically and internationally. So for all those reasons, we should be standing with Taiwan. And yes, the answer to your question is yes, they're taking a big risk. They should be commended for doing so, and they deserve our support.
And Ms. Totek, what do you think?
Maybe just a few words from my side. There were rumors that Poles were very sympathetic towards every nation opposing Soviet Union in our region. Was it true? Yes, it was. Was it deteriorating our relationship with Soviet Union? Yes, it was. So what? Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. I agree. From Hong Kong, I know predominantly opposition, people of opposition leader, while of Taiwan, I know actually almost all leading politicians, regardless to their affiliation, whether in the government or in opposition, meaning that it is really a democratic country, and having simply the Taiwan's existential threat is therefore into Taiwan's democracy from mainland China, and moreover, success on combating COVID-19 is also due to Polish influence. I mean, a long time ago, Polish citizen Ludwig Reichmann, founder of UNICEF and Polish Institute of Hygiene, was the main advisor on public health to Chiang Kai-shek, and he introduced the concept of quarantine, for example. He was renowned bacteriologist. So we have links in this area. Yes, Taiwan is word of becoming observer to World Health Assembly. Also because of this tradition, this country can bring expertise, knowledge to international health security.
Well, thank you very much. This has been, the last questions and the answers were quite optimistic. And possibly the best thing for now to finish off on this optimistic note with all of us and the viewers and our experts hoping that the situation in Hong Kong will actually improve, and the now very vocal response of the international community, of the European Parliament, the British government, and even the US government will actually bring more peace and more calm to the region. So taking this opportunity, I would like to thank our experts so much for taking the time and talking to me, and then giving their enormous expertise to all of the viewers in Poland, in the US, and all the other countries, because I know we even had viewers in Georgia today. So thank you very much for your time, Minister Fotyga. Thank you so much, Mr. Rogers. Thank you. And to all of our viewers that may or will actually keep their interest in Hong Kong, please do remember to follow the European Parliament and the Committee on Security and Defense and the various actions that the European Parliament is doing to help Hong Kong. Please do go and visit the Hong Kong Watch website run by Mr. Rogers to see what can we do and what the international NGOs have been doing. And last, but hopefully not least, please do visit our website. Please do visit the Warsaw Institute and the Warsaw Institute Review. We do have a monitoring program called the China Monitor, where we actually work with experts, Polish experts on China, on writing monthly or even weekly articles on what's happening there. So if you want to be informed, do keep us in mind. And thank you very much all for attending, and we will see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.